My name is Professor Paul Ray. I am a humanities faculty member at St. Mary's College in Moraga, California, and for many years have taught philosophy and literature classes, often with a critical edge, trying to encourage critical thinking. I've also taught environmental studies classes. And so as I phased down my teaching career, I got more and more into looking at 9/11 and particularly the war on terror concept, construct, which has ensued and to this day, tragically in my view, guides a lot of American foreign policy. So I got into 9/11 like a lot of other people because I noticed things that just weren't adding up, and it's not as though I saw the buildings and said, aha, controlled demolition or anything of the sort. Basically, I went through some stages of analysis, and my first level of analysis really was that this was blowback from various covert operations that the U.S. had done against Islamists or Islamic countries over many years, even decades. And then gradually, as I looked more and more into it, I started to understand that that indeed this might be a pattern, fit a pattern where contrived events or false flag operations were used as pretexts to start wars, demonize enemies, and that sort of thing. But I think it's fairly well documented that, as an example, top officials in the Justice Department and so forth stopped over a month, maybe 6 weeks before 9/11, flying commercial airliners, and so that was telling. Actually, I wrote an earlier book called Still Seeking the Truth About 9/11, and that was first a kind of expanded pamphlet, and then it got thicker and thicker, and so then people started saying, well, why don't you cover more aspects of the issue in more depth? Well, there was more and more research coming in all the time, and so it just expanded and expanded into a 500-page book. But this is not a clunker that people don't read. It really is comprehensive on the one hand, but comprehensible on the other. And people often remark on how it's even a page turner because of the fact that I try to rely on stories, and one thing kind of leads to the next, and so hopefully it's an experience in getting the big picture and fitting things together to make sense.
And could you tell us what the main points are that are raised in your book?
Right. The book is Mounting Evidence, Why We Need a New Investigation into 9/11. And probably the main thesis is that, yes, there may well have been involvement by Islamists. I personally believe the evidence shows, as Nafeez Ahmed does, that people, dangerous people in Al-Qaeda did exist and actually had blueprints for attacks on these very buildings, the same targets, as early as 5 or 6 years before 9/11. However, I don't think it's credible to say that these 19 hijackers pulled off an operation like this without some help, and that could be either passive, meaning that responsible public officials looked the other way, were negligent, even actively helped to let it happen, or other people take the view that elements in the U.S. government were actively involved and very much helped to make it happen. So there's all kinds of degrees of alleged involvement, but I think the evidence clearly suggests that that these alleged terrorists did not pull this off all by themselves without some help. Most of the book actually is evidence of that, and it breaks down into a number of sections. One is foreknowledge, meaning the fact that the United States received numerous warnings from numerous intelligence services, from Mossad, from the Soviet, former Soviet Russian service, from actually British MI6. There were just all kinds of things coming in that were really difficult to ignore. So ignored foreknowledge certainly was one suspicious factor. Another was the scheduling of a considerable number of military exercises, all on September 11th, 2001. More than had ever been scheduled before, or some of these exercises had typically occurred a couple months later, but that year were moved up to September. So then you had at least 6 major exercises, and other researchers such as Webster Tarpley have documented considerably more than 6. I stick with 6 because these 6 all had real impacts on the air defenses on that morning. And so one of the key factors is that these war games or exercises were then confusing a lot of air defenders, and you had reports coming in from the FAA, or Federal Aviation Agency, saying, hey, we've got a hijacking, and the military was running a hijacking exercise. So that the military, NORAD, hesitated and said, okay, this is pretty clever. They're actually putting in the hijacking earlier than they were supposed to in this exercise. And so you had air controls having to really overcome resistance because the military, the Air Force, was saying, hey, is this real world or exercise? And so that ambiguity lost precious minutes of response time. And so that is how one of these war games tended to impede what ordinarily is a very swift response by the Air Force and NORAD. Another aspect of this is, of course, exercises that took resources away from where they typically are stationed. So you had exercises in the Arctic where NORAD planes were doing war games with imitation Soviet bombers and so forth. So this diverted dozens, perhaps even hundreds of aircraft that normally would be guarding key U.S. cities, including New York and Washington, and so they were hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and of course unable to streak back in time. Well, I am implying that possibility, and I guess you run into a situation where you can explain many things on the basis of coincidence, but when there are so many coincidences, then it's at a certain point you have to say, well, when does this stop being coincidental? And I don't have an absolute answer to that, but the number of coincidences is indeed quite striking. Even with the military exercises, you had another mass casualty drill. I mean, the military names for these are all in the book, but the gist of it was they were actually gaming an attack on the Pentagon, and so coincidentally you had lots of first responders all poised for what was supposed to be a staged drill, but they were all right in place there to intercede in a very timely way with a real attack. So this seemed kind of strange, and particularly when you had top Bush administration national security officials saying things like, oh, no one could have imagined someone hijacking a jetliner and flying it into a building, that's absurd. They were gaming that very scenario. So you don't set up exercises and game what you don't see as a real possibility.
The implications of what you were saying, how would you respond to people who say, well, that's ridiculous, surely the US administration wouldn't want these attacks to happen because their own people were the targets?
We would love to believe that governments are committed to protecting their citizens, which after all is their charge and trust. But the historical evidence points quite otherwise. In fact, chapter 2 of this book really just creates a background structure where you look at the whole history of not only American, but the beginnings of other major wars, such as World War II, in the European theater with staged events that the Nazis contrived in order to make it look like the Poles attacked them, so that they could then do an Anschluss against Poland. And that's one example. Another controversial, and I take extra pages and do extra documentation, of course, is Pearl Harbor. And this is difficult for a lot of Americans and probably for a lot of Britons as well, because Roosevelt is seen as a great president, and in many ways he was a great president. But we now have just mounds of documentation from declassified documents, cables from the State Department to Honolulu, Hawaii, and all of this that indicates the U.S. intelligence had broken the Japanese code, that the U.S. Navy was getting all kinds of reports from the Soviets, from Dutch freighters, and all of this, like a mass flotilla of Japanese ships are steaming at high speed toward Honolulu. You even have, if you can imagine this, a Honolulu paper that had a headline story, and pardon the phrase, but this is the language they use, Japs to attack Pearl Harbor in the next 24 hours. And this was immediately pulled before it went to the newsstand, but we have a few of these papers left. So obviously journalists knew about this, but this was totally quashed. And again, we have State Department cables that basically say, don't do anything except get those 2 new aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor, which the U.S. Navy did. And so their best weapons, the newest carriers, were not touched by the attacks.
What would you say to people that might say, well, even if what you're saying is true of those particular incidents, they're a long time in the past, we're more civilized now and that wouldn't happen these days?
Well, that's a great question. I'd like to think we're more civilized, but let's bring it right up to very recent history. In 2007, some neoconservatives, including we are very likely to believe Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, the leaders of the neoconservative or neocon cabal, and they were very powerful in the Bush administration. They were planning to simulate or provoke an attack by small swift boats or PT-style boats supposedly belonging to Iran, and create then a situation where the media could film these boats allegedly with Iranian markings, probably much more likely U.S. Navy boats painted to look like Iranian ones, coming out firing a torpedo or otherwise menacing U.S. ships, and therefore this would be a pretext for the U.S. and Israel to do what the neocons have been very clearly wanting to do, and that is to attack Iran. And this is fairly staggering when you think at that time the Allied powers, Britain as well as the United States, were already embroiled in 2 wars and not doing very well in either one of them. So you already had 2 major wars, and here these neocons are wanting to start a 3rd with, in this case, a false flag operation. And you even had, in this case, a classic Cold Warrior Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the fathers of the doctrine of succoring the Soviets in Afghanistan, make them bleed like we bled in Vietnam, Brzezinski told Jimmy Carter. So you had this guy who has tremendous credentials, has been a warmonger and a hawk, going to the U.S. Senate and said, boy, you guys better watch for a provocative act because there are elements in the Bush administration that would like to start a third war against a Muslim country. And so, I mean, this is someone who is definitely an insider warning the U.S. Senate that this was likely. Fortunately, we now know a few responsible admirals and some whistleblowers also together exposed this, but of course it did not get in the mass media. Now it is coming out and in responsible internet sites.
And how about the Obama administration? Have they changed any modus operandi since Bush?
Not significantly, I'm afraid to say. They do not speak of war and terror, but they operate as though that structure, which I argue is really a house of cards, not at all hard to deconstruct when you look at the way the war on terror came about and the way it was declared within hours of the 9/11 attacks. Never did the responsible officials such as Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Bush ever seem to stop to think, oh, well, this could be handled as a legal issue. This is a mass murder. This is a crime that should be dealt with through peaceful legal machinery. They never considered that. They immediately went to, this is an attack on America, and we are going to make Muslims pay. And so Muslims became the new commies. And it just kind of slipped Islam, a radical Islam, into the vacancy that had been left when the Soviet threat disintegrated and China became a friendly and basically state capitalist communist power. So it was okay to do business with them. And so then there was a need for a new threat, and this certainly filled the bill.
And isn't it strangely ironic that we're fighting Al-Qaeda elements within Afghanistan and Iraq, yet at the same time the West is funding the very same Al-Qaeda elements in other areas like Syria and Libya?
Yeah, and that pattern has been true for decades. This is not a big revelation, so I won't ramble on about it, but I think people need to look at the origins of Al-Qaeda, which basically came from the Mujahideen, or what Reagan called freedom fighters, who were trained and equipped and financed by the CIA. And then when the Russians retreated from Afghanistan, you had heavily armed, well-organized, well-trained Islamist fighters who were very confident. Had they basically said, well, we threw one superpower out of here, and let's go after the other one, because the other one, the US of A, was putting installations into Saudi Arabia, which from their viewpoint was a sacrilege to the Holy Land. And you look at the utterances of Al-Qaeda, I mean, these were major issues that they articulated repeatedly. U.S. troops on Saudi soil, and this was huge from their viewpoint. So but then talking about the cooperation, you had the Saudis as well as the CIA basically paying off Al-Qaeda to operate outside of Saudi Arabia and in a distant country like Afghanistan, where they had basically an alliance with the Taliban, but the U.S. had chosen to recognize the Taliban government because they thought that Halliburton and Unocal and these other oil companies could build pipelines through Afghanistan. And when the Islamists started to say, well, you know, we're not really that happy about hosting your, you know, your big corporations and these pipelines. That's when the U.S. conveyed very explicitly to the Taliban government, and this was about 3-4 months before 9/11, either we bury you on a carpet of gold, or we bury you on a carpet of bombs. It's your choice. And they said, you know, if you don't come around on this, the bombs will start to fall in October. The bombing started October 7th. So this was clearly the war on terror was then a pretext for a war that was already planned. The same thing with Iraq, already planned long before 9/11. What was needed, and the neocons said, is some catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor, their language, that would then allow, shock the American public, maybe even traumatize the public into demanding military action, revenge, and then all kinds of domestic repression. So it was aggression abroad, repression at home. Not much different than you've seen here in the UK. But it's very important to understand that crimes against democracy really do go on, and they take different forms. And we need to know the ways that such destructive acts go on in order to protect our democracy. So state crimes against democracy implies internal state terrorism, and that again is a concept that many people have great difficulty with, state terrorism. When you think about it, it's not that hard to figure out. I mean, what was the firebombing of Dresden about, which the Americans and the British, I mean, Nazi Germany was already defeated. Dresden had little military significance, but it sure showed the Soviets, we've got thousands of aircraft that could incinerate Moscow, so you guys had better behave. Same thing with the nuclear bombings. I mean, these were acts of state terrorism because they were designed to terrorize people. The firebombing of Tokyo. I mean, this was not about defeating the Japanese military. It was about terrorizing the citizenry. So, I mean, there's a lot of history of this, and certainly a lot of the behavior of the Israeli government could be seen as state terrorism. And yet it's compartmentalized by our media so that a 14-year-old kid who straps explosives on his belt and blows away Israelis on a bus, that's terrible. That's totally a barbaric act. But when you turn it around, and Israelis send helicopters and F-16s and so forth, and kill dozens of Palestinians with the attempt to terrorize that population, then we need to call that by its right name, state terrorism. So that's why I think your group is heading in very much in the right direction by creating a larger context and just saying, okay, we're talking here about 9/11 in a context of modern politics that seems to be increasingly Machiavellian. Unfortunately, today we could almost conflate state and corporate. And that's a frightening prospect. A fellow named Benito Mussolini was the first to define fascism as basically the melding of church, state, and industry, and that's why he loved that symbol from the Roman axe, where all the sticks or fasces were wired together to make like the really heavy-duty axe. That was the symbol of fascism, and people should just look that up in any dictionary or on the internet, and you see the origins of that concept. And so the question is, at what point it would cross that threshold, where we see basically the corporate state, and there's little distinction between Wall Street and K Street in Washington. I mean, they start to become the same people in a revolving door. I think there was an attempt to build a kind of cult of victimization, a little bit analogous to the way that Israelis have built a kind of cult of victimization. Now, this is not to say that the atrocities of the 6 million, the camps, and everything terrible that went on, I would no way be a Holocaust denier, nor would members of your group, I'm very pleased to see.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we cannot use these horrific historical events as a way to put, to allow the Israelis to cast themselves as victims, and therefore they are entitled to aggress. Similarly, in the United States, there was a massive, I can tell you, having been there at the time, a massive outpouring of victimization, and it would anger a lot of Americans to question, because it was certainly, I mean, a very traumatic, just a really hellacious event, and with massive death, destruction, and all of this. But certainly a term like ground zero would not really apply, because of the degree of destruction was much more limited. You had 3,000 people killed when the trade centers came down, and you had 160,000, check me on that, it might be 140,000, but 140,000 outright at Hiroshima. So that is definitely an asymmetry, so that it seems to imply that the U.S. received a blow comparable to the ones that it delivered on Japan, when, with those 2 bombs, about 200,000 people were killed outright, not to mention hundreds of thousands more over ensuing decades from epidemics of cancers and so forth. So I think allowed Americans to feel that they had been very, very deeply wounded, and therefore very severe military or repressive measures could be condoned. I think many Americans have suspicions about the title, about the stories they have been told, but they don't want to explore in some of the dark recesses for fear of what they might see. We don't go there. And so there's an awful lot of denial and psychic numbing and such. Pardon the psych babble, but those are probably the best terms. And that takes a tremendous amount of courage for them to consider that their loved ones may have been murdered by forces that were aided and abetted by their own government. That is a very unsettling idea, but yes, we have dozens really of people that have been with this all the way and are continuing to speak out and give testimony. And then we're very, very disappointed by the fact that the Commission did not answer about 90% of the questions that they had posed. Also, John Farmer, who was the General Counsel, has written a book criticizing aspects of the Commission, and we, of course, often get quotes from him that this was totally distorted and a bunch of bunker, things to that effect. Unfortunately, that isn't really the thesis of his book, and so it's a little bit disingenuous to give quotes like that from, say, the legal counsel of the 9/11 Commission, because they are out of context or not, they don't typify his position. But still, he critiques a lot of things. And if you look at the sum total of insider critiques, in other words, people that were on the Commission and said something really was wrong here, they do add up to quite a bit. Just alone, they would probably merit reopening that whole investigation. In my view, they would. Just what they said. Now, if you add all the other stuff that whistleblowers and researchers are adding to it, then you have a pretty sizable case for reinvestigating. The last 2 or 3 chapters draw pretty heavily on David Chandler Richard Gates and the architects and engineers, and a number of the technical scholars, Stephen Jones and several others. I love the phrase from Nixon, limited hangouts. So it's kind of like okay, the hounds are on our trail, we're going to, just throw a few hunks of meat, and that'll divert them and slow them down, and they can chew on that for a while, and that sort of thing, a limited hangout. And I see a lot of this as being in that category. I mean, it doesn't really address the fundamental bogus nature of all of the reports, and particularly the NIST report on Building 7 was just scientifically bogus. David Chandler, the physics teacher who did his homework, did the math, and single-handedly stepped up and critiqued the NIST report in such a devastating way they had to change and admit, as you pointed out, that indeed, well, there might have been a little bit of free fall there. But once they do that, then their own theory just crumbles, because the theory they're advancing would not account for that phenomenon. That I think that a lot of the government payouts had the effect of silencing people. In other words, to receive a very considerable sum of money from the U.S. government in a way that was totally unprecedented with any other national disaster or war or anything like that. I mean, I hate to use the term hush money, but sometimes it seems difficult to evade the fact that if people were asked, okay, you sign away all your legal rights for recourse to damage to your body and or your mind if you receive this money, I mean, it does seem like that was the intent. No, this is a huge area. The eco-disaster of 9/11, I think, has been way underreported. There are researchers with good medical backgrounds that are doing some of the work, but again, this has not received much media coverage, and would, if it did, I think, it point to real criminality, because you had Christine Todd Whitman, the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, supposedly the agency responsible for public health and safety, telling people within 4 days of the attacks, oh well, you've got the green light, it's all clear now, and America is back in business, as Bush put it. So I mean, clearly this was a rush to remove the evidence, and get things back to something resembling normality, and at a just horrific cost to people that went about their ways and were breathing asbestos and computer dust and all kinds of toxic soup. I would love to see journals like Lancet or others document this in a medically professional journal. That Silverstein has pretty much just airbrushed his portrait, and now is involved in the building of the new trade tower. Yeah. I think there's some very, very damning evidence that he has never successfully explained. In fact, he has very unsuccessfully attempted to explain, giving absurd answers such as, oh, well, when I said pull it, I didn't mean anything to do with demolish the building, and things like that. I mean, this is highly problematic, and I want to be careful, because we can't say the logic of who had the means, who had the motive, who benefited necessarily leads you to the perpetrator.
How relevant is 9/11 today, and what is its connection to NATO's intervention and the US intervention in the Middle East?
Well, I think it has everything to do with it, because either explicitly or tacitly, the global war on terror is really still in place. place in people's minds. It has become ingrained in the way that the Cold War became ingrained as a way of thinking. And I think you may have noticed in recent months the attempt to slip Iran into this slot, to kind of wedge Iran into that construct where it really doesn't belong at all. Yes, it is an Islamic Republic by name, but the history does not suggest any connection to Al-Qaeda or Islamic terrorism of the sort that is alleged to have contributed to the attacks on the Cole, 9/11, etc. So, but nevertheless, you see by innuendo or sometimes explicit attempting to paint Iran with those colors, setting it up then to be, oh, well, this is the next target in the ongoing war on terrorism.
Is it all about the oil, or is there more to it than just oil?
I think there's more to it than that. I think it's about power projection and the attempt to dominate and, if not control oil for yourself, at least deny it to potential competitors. That whole package. But I think Washington is in a global domination project, has been since World War II. I think that was really evident when the dying Roosevelt went out of his way to meet with the Saudi king on his ship. And what was that about? That was striking one of the most enduring deals. We'll provide the protection, you provide the cheap oil. And so right there, some of the very early alliances were forged, and similarly the Washington-Tel Aviv alliance. I mean, this is about power projection. I know the work of Mikhail Shazadusky, who was a very bright and well-versed researcher, and Global Research is certainly a serious website, very serious. He and I do differ on that. I think he maybe tends to see a higher degree of Washington's involvement than I see evidence for. But you do have to ask questions like, where are the rebels getting weapons where they can shoot down helicopters? It's possible, I suppose, they could buy them on the black market because, after all, Al-Qaeda had some left over from Afghanistan and Stinger missiles and stuff like that. Or could these be more sophisticated, more recent models that were dropped in by the CIA? I don't know. But I think we can say that outside powers like the U.S., UK, or Israel might well be arming elements in the rebels with intent, of course, to profit by the outcome.
Do you think the way the mainstream media goes about reporting events like 9/11 and the Arab Spring and the intervention in the Middle East is satisfactory?
Well, completely unsatisfactory. And I guess that's why we're doing this work. And I mean, every country has a few media outlets that are about half or maybe 2/3 there some of the time. The Guardian might be halfway there about half of the time. On selective issues, they're quite good. But on other things, they don't want to go there. And I think you could, in the U.S., say that the same thing. A lot of American newspapers are just drifting further and further to the right. The Washington Post would be one notable example. Long gone are the days of Woodward and Bernstein. Long gone.
So, how do you see the solution to all this? What are the steps ordinary people can make that might make a difference?
I think the first is to educate oneself, and I guess that's why I write books and do interviews and talk to people and try to reasonably provide an alternative viewpoint. And try to call people's attention to the fact that it's not really sufficient to dismiss someone as a conspiracy nut. This might have really gone on in the real world. People might have really conspired in ways that advanced their objectives for military campaigns or domestic repression, but it came at a horrific cost to the public. That's hard for people to integrate. Your questions have been great.
Thank you. I wish you luck on the rest of your stay.
Thank you for your attention to the issue and really thoughtful questions. They were very good.